Hello and welcome back to another episode of Josh's Engine Rehab. Today I've got a very special episode for you. It's honestly kind of an interesting subject. We're going to be talking about airflow. And if you've been a follower of this channel for a very long time, you'll know that it's been quite a while since we've been on this machine, which is a flow bench. It's a very interesting tool. It's used for measuring the efficiency of a cylinder head, so how much air gets in, how much air gets out. And not only can you measure the volume of air, you can also measure how fast the air is going. And then there's a few other complications beyond that we're not going to get into. Just consider this a basics, a cylinder heads 102 type video. And not only are we going to talk about airflow, we're going to specifically talk about what happens when you restrict airflow. So on the bench today, we've got I think about 2009 Honda CBR600 cylinder head. And this is a sport bike, if you don't know. They rev to about 12,000 RPM. They make about 100 to 120 horsepower. I think they normally have 4 throttle bodies, so an individual throttle body setup, but I think you can also have a pair of carburetors with 2 blades on each of them, and they're pretty badass. But this specific engine isn't in a sport bike, it's actually in a Formula SAE car. So I was asked if I could just get a baseline flow number on the intake and exhaust on the cylinder head, and then I have a very special intake which has a restrictor built into it that I'm going to bolt onto this. So what would normally have to flow through 4 different individual runners, and they'd all act on their own and be very efficient. We're going to join all of these into one, and then it's going to have to flow through a tiny little hole, just like that. And just in case I hadn't driven the point home of how tiny that hole is, this washer is exactly the same size as the restrictor in the intake manifold. So what's that going to be like? I don't actually know the answer. I have never done this before, so we're going to do this together. And without giving too much away, this is our intake manifold. It's got these great long runners, goes into a plenum, and then it has this big elbow that hangs off of it. And then the restrictor lives in this area just about. And then the throttle body's way up here, and then bell mouths up at this venturi. There's also this little foam filter element that hangs over the top of that. And if you're not familiar with what Formula SAE is, it's basically a racing program or a program that's designed to be thought-provoking for young engineering students or college students that are interested in the automotive industry or mechanical engineering in general. So the rules basically are you can choose a very small engine like a Briggs & Stratton, and you basically have no rules. Or you can choose to run a large gasoline engine like this, or I even saw some people ran engines as big as like a Miata or whatever, but those engines have rules and they're restricted. So this team obviously chose to run a larger engine and be restricted, and we're going to get some information for them today. We had to make an adapter plate to reduce the bore diameter on my fixture from 4" 350 to 2.5 inches, which is what the bore size is on this CBR600 cylinder head. So instead of spending the time to make a dedicated fixture, I texted a friend of mine, Jason, and I said, hey, can you print me an adapter plate with these dimensions? And the next day we had this nice little ABS adapter. Came up very nice. I had to make a couple little modifications to it, but Jason came in clutch with this adapter, and that really saved me a ton of time. And then I had to spend a little bit of time making my new equipment work with the 4-valve heads, since I hadn't flowed a 4-valve head with my new equipment yet. I built this valve opening fixture. Apparently it's got some limitations. I tried flowing this earlier on video, and I had a few problems. Like this arm was trying to deflect because I put in checker springs that were a little bit too strong, so it was pushing the arm up at the larger valve lifts. So I got a little creative. You know, I'm a big engineering fan as well, so I came up with this solution after having multiple failed attempts at keeping this thing stable. The zip tie keeps this thing from moving. I didn't notice it until I was reviewing the footage, but you could literally see this whole dial indicator, the whole valve opening setup moving upward on camera, and I had to redo all the footage, and that's what we're doing now. Necessity leads to innovation, and that zip tie solved all of my problems. And I'll know in the future, especially on a little tiny engine like this, you don't need so much spring pressure on the checking springs. And if you don't know what a checking spring is, basically they're little light springs that you install on a cylinder head for mock-up. Or if you're on the flow bench, you can't have the factory springs inside of the cylinder head while you're doing all your testing. So we'll fly through this today. I'm just going to include a little bit of the flow bench footage. I'll get the intake bolted on, show you a little bit of that footage, and then we'll go review all the numbers. And just to give you an idea of how large this intake manifold is, I mean, it's at least 2 bananas, maybe 2.5 bananas. Look at that. This thing's a monster. Yeah, I'd say that's about, oh no, that's about 3.5 bananas. I wonder what that's all about. When I was researching Formula SAE engines using CBR600 cylinder heads, I found many different intake setups. There were guys that had intakes that were super short, something like that. There were some guys that had super long ones that ran downward. This one runs upward. It's kind of a cool thing to see what young people come up with as far as solutions to what they decided was a problem and what they wanted these engines to behave like. And it's programs like this that feed the automotive industry, and that's how you end up with vehicles that are as badass as the ones that we have on the road today. And if you don't spend a lot of time around a large variety of vehicles, they just keep getting better. Everyone wants to complain about how vehicles have lost their soul, or they're never the same, or they're so expensive. But in a world with ever-evolving regulations and these rules making it very difficult for automakers, you need young people filtering into the industry with fresh ideas, because unfortunately, you can't have the same engineer for decades and decades. So the Formula SAE program is very important, and it's very good. And it fosters innovation in our industry. All right. So I've got my 0 set here. This is an automatic valve opener. Before I had some weird dial indicators that with thumb screws. Honestly, that's a lot faster. Once I finish installing my data acquisition boxes and my motor controls on this machine, I'll be able to make this process a little faster and a lot more streamlined. But in the meantime, I'm just going to use the electronic controls for the valve opener, and then I'll be inputting all of my information into the computer manually. So a little cumbersome, but it is nicer than having to sit there and do a bunch of math. So once that's installed, it'll be set up with the same exact calibration that all the analog controls are set up on. So it won't matter if I use this machine using the analog gauges, using the regular old manometers and the flow scale, or if I use the electronic equipment, which ties into my software here. But I've always basically just used this software for the data entry anyways, but now I'm starting to utilize some of the features since, I purchased all this stuff like 8 years ago, and it's been sitting in the bottom of my toolbox forever. So I'm lucky that it all still works after blowing off all the dust. Now, the internet has become a real problem because a lot of companies publish flow numbers. So the whole internet is full and oversaturated with all this information, but most people don't know how to interpret that information. So basically, when you see flow data that's published online, you're generally only going to see information like CFM. So CFM is cubic feet per minute. How much volume of air is entering or exiting the cylinder head per minute. That is just one metric that's measured on a flow bench. And I've yet to see a company publish other metrics that most of the time they can measure and publish and show you guys, like velocity or swirl or tumble, or showing you graphs like a velocity gradient, or even going well beyond that and showing you information like wave data. The moral of the story is don't get lost in the sauce with CFM. Now, it's a very common occurrence where you'll have two engines that are basically the same combination, yet the cylinder heads might have different porting or different airflow characteristics. There are many times where a cylinder head may flow less than another, but that car accelerates harder or goes faster and just makes more power overall. And then the one that made more airflow looked good on a flow bench, but really was a dog. So you got to remember, we're not racing flow benches. Flow benches are just another tool. And a trap that a lot of people fall into is they just see a number and they go, bigger is better. But that's not the case. It's much more complicated than that. So we're set up. I've got the valve opened 50 thousandths of an inch. We'll be doing 50 thousandths increments on each test, and then we'll be stopping at 375 thousandths of valve lift. Anything beyond that, and the retainer tries to make babies with the valve guide. And another thing you need to do is you need to break the sharp edge using either a clay entry or having a radius plate. If you don't do that and you try to flow a cylinder head with a port that has a sharp edge like this, it's just not going to work. You've got to break that edge in some way. Air doesn't like to turn more than 15 degrees at a time, so a 80-degree turn like here is a big no-no. So I'm not going to get in a habit of flowing CBR600 heads, I don't think. So in the meantime, we're just going to do a clay entry, and that's going to be plenty good enough here. And also, I had to go to Target and buy a box of Play-Doh. And all the single moms that were watching this strange, dirty man in the toy section buying a box of glitter Play-Doh, it was a little overwhelming. They weren't too happy. So needless to say, security met me at the door and they said, don't come back here. So what you're gonna see me do is I'm gonna be operating these knobs. This knob is for exhaust, this knob's for intake. We'll be adjusting the intake side during this test, and what that's gonna do is it's gonna allow me to act on these gauges here, and you'll see fluid rise and fall in these gauges, and what that number that's red on the gauges represents is atmospheric pressure, and I'll be setting it at 28 inches of water, or basically 1 psi. On all of the tests we'll be doing. There's some flow benches that are really Billy Badass that can flow test a head at 100 inches of water, which is a lot more representative of the real running conditions of a cylinder head. But there are very few of those in the country, and they're starting to trickle down into the smaller shops. I've spent a few years trying to build one, and then all of the data acquisition companies kind of laughed at me when I asked them how would I control it using their equipment. So I abandoned that idea. But I once owned a giant centrifugal blower, which was like 2 giant superchargers bolted up to a 80 horsepower electric motor. and I wanted to plug that giant blower into one of these cabinets, and yeah, that was a thing for a while. And now essentially the higher the depression numbers, or the atmospheric pressure number is, the higher the resolution or the accuracy of your reading is. So it just gives you more and more information that you can use to design or change a port with. All right, let's go. These ports, when I was blowing them originally, they were really, really whistly. That's pretty common in 4-valve ports. out my gauge. Now, if you watch the scale, you'll see this dark fluid move, and then I'm taking numbers off of this once I set that red gauge at 28 inches. $69, nice. All right, let's finish out this test. Very, very whistly on the floor. I would like to make that more quieter, but that's not my job. We're up at 300 thousandths of lift. The head is starting to slow down. That's pretty representative of OEM cylinder heads. Very, very commonly they're going to slow down at the higher lift. Very commonly they'll stop flowing at the high lift. Fuck. God fucking damn it. So now I'm done flowing this with the clay entry. Now I'm going to bolt the intake manifold on and do my test with that. I'll have to block off these injector holes. I'll just put some clay over the top of that. And that will work out just fine. Okay, let's get this tested. Very, very different. That's definitely restricted. Okay, we're on the last test. I've got all the information I need out of the intake manifold without the filter. I've done all the tests with the filter so we can see how much airflow that thing's worth. And let's see what kind of data we have to review. Contact. I didn't even have to touch the knob. All right, let's get this printed off. All right, everyone. So the results are in. So let's start here. Row 1 here, or column 1, that's going to be our initial test. That's the cylinder head on its own with no intake manifold and no restrictor bolted on. And considering how tiny the bore is and how tiny the valves are in this thing, 150 CFM by 350 thousandths of valve lift is pretty damn good. You can see right around 300 thousandths of lift, it starts falling on its face. If there was more room to open the valve, we would find that this head is going to stop flowing beyond 350, and our flow number would stay around that 140, 150 mark. The interesting thing is once we bolted that intake manifold, things changed quite a bit. And in my head, I was imagining that we'd lose about 40% worth of our airflow. And I guess I wasn't too far off base, but let's just let the results speak for themselves. So at 50 thousandths, we didn't lose a whole lot. We lost about 5 CFM. But once we get into the higher lift numbers, so say 200, our lift number goes to 103 to 77, and just a little bit less with the filter. So column 3 here is the intake manifold bolted on with the filter on the intake. Test 2 was the intake manifold without a filter. And the filter didn't really mean much. We only lost a couple CFM here and there, but for all intensive purposes, these flow numbers are exactly the same. But from going to unrestricted head to restricted, we're losing anywhere from 5 to, at the higher lifts, we're losing 57 CFM at 350 thousandths of valve lift. That is insanity. At low lifts, the intake manifold isn't affecting a whole lot. And that makes a lot of sense considering that the valve curtain area, which is the amount of area surrounding the valve when it's open, so think of a three-dimensional space or a cylinder surrounding the valve, it probably matches the 20 millimeter orifice pretty damn well. So once we get up above 200 thousandths of valve lift and beyond, that's where you start to see the restrictor really come into play. And it looks even worse once you look at the airflow change as a percentage number. 50 thousandths is a negative 17% loss. Then you go to basically 6%, basically 10, 25, 31, 35, 38, and if we had more room for valve lift, it would just keep getting worse from there. I guess that restrictor is doing its job. That was pretty interesting to see how that was going to play out. I meant to have this printed out for you, but I accidentally touched some things in my program, and it very much screams Windows 98. So settings and printer setups are not very intuitive. I went back and forth trying to figure out how to get this formatted the way it's always been formatted for years, and I can't get it to do it. And apparently my printer wants to print double-sided, so yeah, technology is not my friend today. But anyways, that's it. I'd call that a video. It's a short one for this week. I'm going to a bachelor party this weekend. My best friend's flying in from New Hampshire, and we're going to have a blast in Lake Tahoe with our childhood friends. But I'm Surprise, surprise, I'm designated driver, so I'll be babysitting. I appreciate it, you guys. Quick video today. Big props for you guys blowing up that Porsche video, by the way. I really appreciated that, and then that was a really pleasant surprise. That video is on track to be one of my best videos ever. So leave a comment. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Like the video as well. That helps me out a lot, and I guess I'll see you next time. I would say it's time to go. Thanks for watching. Oh, and by the way, I hate Play-Doh. It's disgusting. It disgusts me. It gives me the ick.
It ends up coming out kind of like the peanut sauce you'll get like Vietnamese.
Hey, there's a bunch of slime here. I start drawing shit. And then I'm like, wait, there's torpedo tubes right here. So I draw these two massive, like 8-foot long, just rocket torpedo dicks. Just with fucking jets and fucking flames coming out the back, big old nutsacks. And I was proud of my work, you know? And then I leave I leave the week after that, and I don't think anything of it, right? And then go back to Virginia, and a week later, or 2 weeks later, we get word that that ship, or that sub, is going into dry dock, because they couldn't make the repairs. And I was like, oh, fuck. Oh, fuck. And the captain of the ship was really upset with the divers.
That, like,
That wrist shot, Mitchell.
Democrats and shit.
Mitchell.
Yeah.
He's on Blue Sky.